I just do 16 underlayment, you know, the 14 bucks a sheet at Home Depot. I actually scarf that stuff so I can build my templates the same length as the boat. And the email that I talked about,
Joel White in his books says to scarf
right
the full sheet.
So does John Brooks.
4 feet wide, and then start cutting points.
Yes. So does John Brooks. That's the way he does it. And Ian Rookin says you can do it either way. I choose to do it. So imagine that these are actually 4 feet wide, and that each one of these little pieces here is actually 8 feet long or 5 feet long or whatever. The email that announced this, I said there were 21 scarves in that Whitehall that I built. Why 21? Why an odd number of scarves? How is that even possible? Well, it was a 15-foot boat, which means that you just get a nice 15-foot plank out of your 16 feet of plywood. The problem, if you just decide to go ahead and do all of it that way, is you wind up, you'll notice the puzzle joints in this boat all line up. Some people say it weakens the boat. Some people say it's just bad form. Ian Uchard says it's just bad form because the epoxy scarf is actually stronger than the original plywood. But either way, I've always tried not to line up the scarf, which means
or it's just plain ugly.
Yeah. For a 15-foot boat, I bought 4 sheets of plywood, 2 sheets per side. One of them I did 8 foot to 8 foot. The other one I cut one piece in half and did a 4-8-4. Then I alternated the strakes so that there was one with 2, one in the middle, next one with 2. So I wound up with 3 joints for each round of planks. One on one side would have 1 joint, the one on the other side would have 2. 7 strakes, and you wind up with 21 scarves, which seems odd. How can you, on a symmetrical boat, how can you wind up with an odd number of scarves? In fact, I did. So imagine that these are long sheets of plywood, as long as you need. You know, if you're building an 11-foot boat, they can be 1 sheet and a half sheets. If you're building a 15-foot boat, they're going to be full-length sheets. Anything in between. A 10-foot boat, you could just make them, you know, 4 sheets of plywood, or 5 sheets of plywood would give you 4. Build 2 boats. So, step 1, you lay out your plywood, and you draw a mark. I use 8 to 1. John Gardner says 10 to 1. I have never been able to get a feather edge to even remotely hold up. I mean, 12 to 1. At 12 to 1, I've never been able to get a feather edge that will hold up at all. If you think about it, you're starting out with a piece of veneer that's only 1.2 millimeters thick, and you're trying to put a taper on it that's that long. You just really can't do it. So I use 8 to 1. So this being 6 mil, 1/4 inch close enough. These are 2 inches. Make sure you draw a line at the 2 inches. You don't need it to line them up, but draw it anyway. Either a pencil line. Ian Uchard says to use a sharp marking knife. Either way, you're going to wind up with a line that's hard to get rid of. But it's important you have that line because that tells you when you get ready to glue your pieces together, that tells you where they want to line up. So this is a stack of plywood, a bunch of long sheets. If you're curious, look at this picture right here. This is my scarfing rig at home. Set up for, I'm not sure whether it was, I think this is for the 12-foot boat. I can't tell. But, so this piece right here is this. Down here is my gluing. Yep. And the rest of it, just these scraps of wood that hold it all flat. Now this is all screwed down. The scarfing table is just a piece of MDF. I chose MDF because it's about 1 inch wider than 4 feet, which gives you just a little bit of overlap, and we'll see why that's important later. But I cut a piece off of it and put it on at right angles. That's just to keep it flat. In practice, I don't think it matters a whole lot because even if it's curved, you're going to be planing the same curve all the way across, and I'm not sure everything matters. So you lined up the plywood you're going to scarf. I'm going to do 4 pieces of plywood to scarf. This last piece is my own invention, as far as I know. I haven't seen anybody do it. I don't know whether others do it, and I just haven't read about it or not. But what it does out Bubba here. If you imagine me cutting down till I get there, I can't cut anything I'm not supposed to. Unless I cut the edge of this piece of wood, I can't cut anything I'm not supposed to. Now I can certainly rip some pieces out if my technique is for it, and probably will, certainly have, but there's no way to cut too deep. So this is your guide that says when you get down here so that the heel of your plane is right in there, the nose is touching the edge of this MDF, you're there. So that's why I do it that way. The thicker your plywood, the bigger plane you need. I use a number 5 most of the time, which is what's called a jack plane. My collection of planes are all eBay specials. Miller's Falls, what's that? Lakeside, Lake something, which was Montgomery Ward's. Some Stanleys, they're all reasonably good planes if you buy anything that was made, you know, in the 50s or earlier. And with a little bit of work, they can all be made quite usable. They all copied Stanley. This is a Miller's Falls, and you can take the parts off of it, bolt them to a Stanley, and vice versa. But you don't have to have a really good plane for this. You need a sharp plane. You need to know how to get them sharp, and you need to be prepared to sharpen them again. I was working on some pieces for the gluing demo later, and those are pieces left over from Stanley boat build. The quality of my work is not what I would normally expect. And I got more tear out than usual, and it was also an awful lot of work, I have to tell you. The reason is, it's just a lot harder planes. I've always worked with a Kume, and there's a big difference. But that was my first experience, and be ready to sharpen a lot. It just eats a plane blade. So you got your stack made here. This piece, as I say, you don't have to whole sheet of plywood, just be strip of wood. All of the screws that hold this down, forget about those, because if you have a stack of plywood that comes out to here, you just clamp them to the edge, back where the plane won't hit it. So I had to screw this all down because it's a mock-up, but normally you just stack your plywood up, clamp it, and that's all you need to do.
Mitch,
yeah.
Question. Is there something magic about the distance?
Yes. Oh, sorry. Thank you very much. So you'll notice that this one's 4 inches back. What that means is that if you were scarfing this one, its nose would wind up there. Since we're not cutting it at all, we put it back 4 inches, and we want to plane down until we plane that line.
Right.
So it's always double the. It's always
double your space. Yeah.
Right.
And you can do as many sheets of plywood as you want. Actually, for scarfing, as long as you've got a long enough plane body, more is better. It gives you a larger flat surface, which cuts easier. I'll show you when I get started. I'm not gonna plane this whole thing down today because you don't want to watch me work that. And doing it at home, what I do is I'll do about first 6 or 8 passes with my electric. I lay it right on this thing, and the nose of it just eats plywood. But I'm terrified to get, you know, within even an 1/8 of an inch of finished because of the way it eats plywood. So I'll just get it close, get it started with the electric. You don't want me to do that here either, because no one would hear anything, and it would be dust flying everywhere. But you can get started with the electric, and then when you get close, go to the hand plane. So I wanted to show you something here, because I'm going to demonstrate a never before proven technique. I just invented this to try to fix this. So if you look at this, this is a piece that was left over from one of my builds. And this spot right here has some kind of ugly tear out. I was painting the outside of this particular boat, so that would go on the outside had I needed to use it, and not in the shear straight. This side's pretty good. I would have used any of that, even in a shear straight. But the problem, this is right at the actual edge of the panel, and I took one pass with a jointer just so that you could see the edge. Because if you pass this around, you look at the edge, you'll see that the veneers don't quite line up. That's because it's really extremely difficult to get all the way down right here on this end. You have no place to put the end of the plane. So extremely difficult to get a nice straight clean cut right down there. If you plane straight down, you're going to tear out the cross grain. If you plane across, you're going to make this. Plane to the other angle. You can, but running off the edge will also grab pieces of tear. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So you want to plane into the edge if you can. So I'm going to pass this around. If you see this one that's marked shallow cut, that's where I just didn't get it deep enough. You'll notice that looking at the side, veneers don't quite line up. And I sanded, pretending I was trying to get rid of that. You'll see what's happening is the nose of this piece of plywood is drawn back. But by the time I actually get it smooth, you're going to see glue for the next veneer. So that's a cut out and throw away piece.
So does it help on the edge if you have a sacrifice piece on both edges?
Well, let me point my drill on. I'll show you my new invention. I haven't actually even used this even once, so you're going to know when I know whether it works.
Yeah.
Now, if you were doing full width panels, you need to take it out there. Take it out there. But so when I start planing, I usually start. This is a number 4, and I usually start with a number 4. The reason is you see how this is sitting. I got the heel sitting where it's supposed to sit. The nose isn't quite down on this board, so I can actually make a cut here. And what you have to do to get started, because what will happen is eventually you get where the nose of your plane is resting on this plane, and you can't cut that.
Yeah.
So come down here and just start kind of eyeballing. As long as your plane's riding on this ramp, you can't cut too deep. So just get started there and then work your way up. And now I'll switch to the one I use for most of the cut. The only reason I have Bubba is because my next boat was going to be 3/8 plywood. However, the cutter is wider too, so it's actually kind of a handy thing. But cut down like this. And just keep working your way down. See how it's hard to see the next veneer come up. You wind up with these lines. And the proof that you're getting it right, they'll never be perfectly straight. Even that's acceptable. But we should have relatively straight blue lines. So you just keep planing down, and this extension is going to let me plane all the way down here. Oh, I didn't mention the reason you need an angle. If you try to plane across, you're going to tear this. You try to plane straight down, 1, you're going to wind up with a whole bunch of grooves, and 2, you're going to tear the cross. So something about 45 degrees seems to be about the best. And you just keep working your way down. And don't be too timid. Starting, you can make pretty deep cuts. You're going to want to back off when you get close and lighten up the cut a little bit. Now, I can make this deep cut at this plane. I'm strong enough to make. And it helps to be slightly ambidextrous because you're going to want to plane from the other other direction over there. You can go most of the way across that way.
And all you do, you just keep going until that reaches that.
Right. And I get to the point where this line and that line, I should have 4 glue lines, relatively straight. Ideally, not too much tear out. If you find that you've made a really ugly bit of tear out, it's really not fatal. Just unclamp the stack, slide the sheet out that's ugly until you get the ugly to the end, and then plane it off. So, and you're going to have some tear out. It's not going to be perfect. This is the one that I said, you know, I would use this in a shear strip. By the way, when you fill the holes, you don't know this, always fill holes with darker than the wood, than the base wood. Makes them look like knots. If you have a light spot, it looks like epoxy. So mix up, you know, like I use mahogany wood paste or just the system 3 wood paste. It's dark enough for a thumbnail. So it winds up dark instead of light. Looks better. You are going to have some holes. It's unavoidable when you go to clamp it together, unless you have some industrial prep that you can put your boards in. So I'm not going to attempt to get it all the way down. ready to, I can't take that apart anyway because I glued those strips together. So that I would have something that would be felt, it needs to be solid enough to plane, and that's not a problem if you have 8-foot long sheets stacked together. Make sure they're perfectly clean. Sweep them, lay out a sheet, get it lined up, sweep it off, lay the next one down. You don't want any, you know, shavings or whatever drifting out of the overhead, making your stack uneven. But other than that, there'll be plenty. Nothing needs to hold them together at all. Just clamp them at the edges and you're good. So we'll imagine that I'm done. All right. Yeah, I'm going to be breathing too hard before I get on. It takes me about an hour to do a 4-foot, you know, 4 sheets of plywood, 4 feet across. And that's not too much time when you think about the process of building a boat. To me, you know, it's worth it, and I think that this process winds up with a more reliable scarf. I actually cut, because I was only using a short piece of plywood. I actually cut this one on a table saw. As you can see, it didn't come out real nice on the edge. Yeah. Just, you know, I did the trig, I think it's 8 degrees. Tilt the blade.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
You have to clamp it to another piece so it can't slide down into it. It's past the blade when you've got a tape. You can't cut it. You can't cut an 8-foot piece like that because, well, you could roll the table saw out here. You could cut a long piece. It would be very hard to hold it parallel to the 8 feet up and parallel to the blade.
What about the, I think actually the shop has one. I don't know if we, where you use the
Henry jig?
Yeah, is that what it is? Yeah.
I don't know if we still have it or not.
Yes, Randy is holding it for safekeeping and using it at the moment. Oh. But I had lost track. I knew somebody had borrowed it. Yes, we do have a Henry jig. It's a little device that you clamp a electric planer to, and that creates that angle. I have not had, I've tried it just a little bit, and because of it uses about, I would say, a 15-degree angle on the planer, I've wound up with too much tear out. Now, it does give me the advantage of being able to do a little bit thicker panel, because you do your panels one at a time, and a 4-inch planer would actually make a scarf in 1/2 inch plywood. I didn't mention that, you know, if you were up to 1/2 inch plywood, remember you're going to have a ramp that long now. This doesn't scale well. This works well for up to about 3/8, and then something like the Henry Scarfer, or there's a number of different ways to split it up.
For the power circuit, hand circuit.
Yeah, skill saw.
Yeah, those are guaranteed in plywood like this. Those are just guaranteed to be a mess, because your circular saw blade itself is just not made to cut a fine feather edge. mean, imagine that this was actually a pine feather inch like that. This there. You're not going to be able to cut that in a circular saw. That was cut with the about $150, best you can get blade.
Mm-hmm.
Needs like plane. So when you finish, you're all done cleaning. Almost everybody will tell you to lay your sheets out on a bench and glue them up. And most of them recommend that you actually do a fairly thick stack, but do them all at once. I did that one time and I would never do it again. For one thing, even with really slow epoxy, it's going to take you a while to get that stack put together. And God forbid it goes off when you're not ready. But to me, there's an even more important reason. And it relates to how well you control the amount of epoxy you put on. So imagine that I take these two tapered pieces here and wet them down, put some thickened epoxy on one of them. I put them down like that. I put another board over them and I squeeze. You know what hydraulic jacking is? Okay, thick epoxy is relatively viscous, which means that when you start squeezing down, it'll flatten out. But if you want to squeeze it down anymore, it has to come out. And if this is a long workbench, it's got to go out 8 feet. There's no possibility that's going to happen. You're going to wind up with a puddle of thickened epoxy that's actually holding your clamping poles apart. So what you wind up with is 2 pieces of plywood that don't quite meet, some thick epoxy in the middle, and a joint that you're never going to be able to sand out. So you have to be able to get those faces down until they're actually in contact. So I've always done one joint at a time, and the way I lay them out, you can see the rest of the table there. The picture again. This piece right here is that piece there. So you take the 2 pieces that you intend to glue together. I'll just use these 2. And set one of them up like that. This board is 2.5 inches wide. Actually, I think it's 2 3/4 or something like this. It's nearly the width of the joint. So wax paper or packing tape, whichever your preference. I used to use wax paper. I've gone to packing tape because you can't accidentally get it pinched in the joint.
I used saran wrap once, and when I got all done, there was saran wrap coming out of the scarf, and I had to cut it off and throw it away. I see
exactly. You can do the same thing with wax paper. Wax paper does a very fine job of keeping your scarf from sticking together. So
yeah.
Don't let it get. Oh, and when you're flipping around these 4x8 sheets with an end that looks like that, be careful, because you can just destroy the end of that. So what I do is I'll lay this one down. I would go ahead and just clamp it down to the table. I only got that much room to clamp it. Switch them around. So I would clamp it down here, line it up so I'm right in the middle of the scarf. Now you see, I didn't put a line on it. My bad. I'm going to have to eyeball where the end of the scarf could be.
That's how my saran wrap got sucked into the joint, trying to, line it
So,
up.
so I'm going to bring the other sheet up. I'm going to clamp that one down to the board. I'm going to bring the other sheet up, and I'm just going to slide it up along my plywood until I get it there, where my eyeball says that's about right. And I don't have a pencil with me, but here's one. Come on. Thank you very much. So now I'm going to have a straight edge over the whole length of my table here. And what I'm going to do is just backward somewhere, make some registration marks.
With it not sticking out.
Yeah, it might just start out of the way.
I got a regular one of the main problems of old age. No lead.
Okay. comment. All right, I sort of have marks. So I've made those registration marks. That means I know I can get this thing exactly where it belongs. If it's up against this straight edge, that line and that line are lined up, it's exactly where it needs to be. But this one where I set it back there, I usually just slide that one out a little bit or something. So it's just out there where I'm not getting too much epoxy on my gluing balls. Paint it with unthickened epoxy, both faces. Paint this one gently. It doesn't take a lot. Maybe a 30-second to 3/64 stick, no more than that. Don't make it a 60 because you're just going to wind up with a whole lot scrape off.
You just use clear epoxy, not thicken.
Okay, I wet it with just clear epoxy. Then I thicken. I use about a teaspoon for 1 pump, which is what it takes to do one of these scarves. Yeah, I use about a teaspoon of silica and about 2 teaspoons of wood flour. The wood flour is mostly there to make the joint look more like wood.
Oh yeah.
Because if you have bits that wind up not quite filled, like this bit right here. It doesn't look a lot like wood, but it looks more like wood. That's epoxy.
Then it fills with silica.
Yeah. So I use the silica because I just like the way it makes the epoxy work. Yeah. And then I use the wood flour to make it look more like wood. And then flip this over again very, very carefully, not letting it touch anything. Get it back away from where it belongs and just slide it up. So I have reclamped that one on the line. I slide that one up till I get to the line I made previously. And now I'm ready to clamp it in place. So what I'll do is down along the side here somewhere, I'll put a clamp there and a clamp there. This one should be covered with packing tape as well. Do that ahead of time. So Ian Utridge says, use machine screws. I tried machine screws one time and it was so fussy because you have to drill all those holes. Now I have to get them all lined back up, put these 632 screws through from the top, get down underneath and put nuts on them and tighten them all up. So my favorites for this thing, on back bits from DRK. They come in a few different lengths, and what you want is a length that's going to go through your scarf and through your upper clamping ball and thread into the bottom. So you can see I use the same holes over and over here. I never get them lined up exactly right. So I make all new holes every time down there. But these screws, I broke one of, I didn't break the screw. I broke the T15 driver bit one time. We had a conversation at one of those Saturday morning Zoom meetings about getting screws out after they got epoxy on them. I have never had a problem with these screws, so I wanted to see if it was possible to have it. I drilled a hole into a 4x4, filled it with thickened epoxy, and drilled the screw in all the way. Yes, they will stick.
It did stick then.
Yeah, but the coating on those keeps them from sticking. They cut their own threads as they go in, so they actually make a very nice. And you want to make sure you have this whole thing, so you got clamps in it. And now what you're doing is you're just getting ready to clamp the joint down.
So what are
Does the
those?
screw have a name? The cabinet screw?
Cabinet screw, yeah. I'll show you what we have a block on that here. And they come in, this is a 2-inch, which is about like my curve. Find them at Home Depot.
Yeah.
And they're T15. They never slip, easy to drive. And the main point is this unthreaded shank is going to be what's in my cover plate and my scarf. The threaded part is going to be down into the bottom point. And I just run them down till they touch. Run them all the way across, screw it all the way down. And then This is where that hydraulic jacking thing comes in. Come back, get a hand screwdriver, give them about a quarter of a turn until they feel snug. Go all the way across, come back and do it again. What that does is, if you've got any epoxy trap in here, because these things are narrow, you can drive it out. So you'll wind up actually with one of these still has, I think on the back, this one might have, yeah, you can see the ridge. I've sanded it off and scraped it off. But that's where the, yeah, that's where the ridge wound up. So because there's, you know, there's a place for the epoxy to go, if you just tighten these down with a hand driver, go across a couple of times, when they're nice and snug, you've got the joint touching, you're not going to over dry it. It's almost impossible to over dry it because this makes it fairly rough. This cross plane makes fairly rough surface. So you squeeze it out so that you have your two faces exactly lined up. Wait a day, take the screws out. I usually wait another day. I picked up the sheet and set it aside so I can do another scarf, but I don't do any cutting with it or move it around or flex it until it's had about 2 days to cure. I didn't bring, I meant to bring my very favorite tool for cleaning up. When you unclamp it, I thought I had one that I hadn't touched. But, well, this is one I hadn't touched, but it just didn't have my squeeze out. So it's going to look at least like that. That's about as clean as they get. And if you take, what are they? You remember what they're called, John? It's just a paint scraper.
Oh, the carbide one?
Yeah, but they make a paint scraper just like an ordinary house paint scraper, the hook scrapers. Only instead of the cheap steel hook thing that would be dull after one stroke, you have a replaceable carbide blade. It's exactly the same as the blade in an electric planer. You clamp that in there and scrape.
Actually.
Yeah.
And usually they have a curved pin, a relief pin. Yeah. So
but they're double edged. And the thing that I don't have any good way to explain, but I have discovered at least with Kume, and I think I've tried it on the reach, but I can't remember. It doesn't cut the wood. You have to really lean on that scraper to cut the wood, but because the epoxy is a lot harder, it cuts the epoxy. So you can just scrape.
What about using a heat gun and the scraper?
Heat guns, I actually called the guys at West System because I was curious about heat guns, and what they told me is that 220 degrees or thereabouts is lethal. Yeah. So you can heat the epoxy to about 150 degrees and very easily scrape it off. Unless you have a very controllable heat source. If you get the epoxy that's actually in underneath this feather edge to 220 degrees, it will release and it won't reattach.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Is this dimension same as, bigger than, or smaller than the scarf overlap?
it's bigger by a quarter of an inch.
Okay. And the reason is
just enough so that you make sure you're holding down all of these little feather ends. Something I didn't mention. When you're trying to make your scarf look nice, you can actually get away with excess overlap. So back off there a little bit. Now you can see the flame marks there. Yeah. If I go right there, they're perfectly in line. If I go just about 1/16 of an inch more, now I have just a little bit of wood here that I can sand off after I'm done. You want to make sure your cover is wide enough to cover the whole thing.
I asked question number 1 so that I could ask question number 2. You've got this right here.
Mm-hmm.
You're ready to go.
Yeah.
If you put packing tape right there,
mm-hmm.
and right there, then the squeeze out will lay on top of the tape. So when you pull the tape off, you've got a pristine line. Is that a value or too much trouble? Or
it would be a value.
Or is there So possibility, you might know, a possibility of messing something up.
Well, the only thing that could go badly wrong would be if you got your packing tape just a little too close and it got under any of these little feather edges, because you can't get it out and then go back down. So you have, if you were to draw a line, what I might do is draw a line like an 1/8 inch back. Put your packing tape. You can even do that ahead of time.
Right.
But draw the line an 1/8 inch back from the overlap, so yeah, make sure you can't get it in. If you got it in the overlap, then you're screwed.
Yeah, I was thinking you get it all set up with no glue. All set up. Lay this down.
Yeah.
Hold it down some, and then
Right.
lay a piece of tape so that it just barely touches this, because it's
Yeah.
an 1/8 of an inch wider on each side. Then you take it
Yeah.
off and put it on your glue.
It would work unless you miscalculated in some way.
Unless you
Because
screw
these
it up.
things are a little bit wobbly. I mean, you're never going to get. I have never achieved, this perfectly straight taper 4 feet long.
But Chuck's suggestion of putting the tape down, of having the pressure board in place, so the tape is up close to the pressure board, so you're allowing for that little wave.
You also want to make sure you don't glue this thing to your plywood.
Right. Well, that's the underside of it needs to be covered with that.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
So
And this-
underside and turned up over the edges.
Right.
Yeah. Because you don't want it to wind up gluing down. It'll rip the face off the plywood right off. If it winds up epoxy the plywood.
Okay, now this is all handwork.
Right.
And it's wonderful. I applaud you. Anybody in the group have a power tool solution to this?
Power plane.
Just a PowerPoint, but that imaging, I guess. That's
Power plant, depending on the width, only gets you part way, like you're doing 1/2 inch, you only get 2.5 inches, and you need 4 inches, then you got to do the rest by hand for the power plane.
I have one. I have not done it. It's just impractical. You need such a long straight edge, and it'd be complicated to do. I have done it for individual planks up to about that wide, and that is you take. Imagine there's something like that, another rail, and you put an inclined plane. You screw it into an inclined plane. So now you have these rails, and you have an incline that matches your desired scarf. You get a long straight edge that you clamp to the bottom of your router sled. And you straighten that bit. You just slide the router back and forth, and you can cut. But if you were doing individual planks, I think that's the way I would do it. Once you get the depth set properly in your router bit, you know exactly where to put the edge of the plank so that you're going to cut right to your line. I do that. I have one of those at home. It's only about that wide, and I only use it for boards. Never
So
use it.
you will bring all that in and show us how to do it another day.
I will do that. I have actually 2 scarfing jigs. One of them, you'll see here, my 2x4s, that I use for building frames and they periodically get too short. And if you look at the one on this side, it's this one. Yeah, this one, there's a scarf through it because my boards got too short and I didn't want to throw them away. So, in fact, I didn't even have quite enough wood to make the full scarf. See, I ran out there. Yeah. I have a tapered sled that I made for my table saw for that kind of scarf. And if I want to do faces, then I use a router. But I've never done plywood that way. Part of it is because any power tool, as you're getting down to that paper thin edge, you're just going to have to tear out. When you're scarfing real lumber, you start out with a thicker board than you want to end up with, and you overlap it past a little bit, and then you run it through the planer and make the face flat, and you have a perfect scarf.
Russ and I had to scarf some gunnels for family boat build.
I just made a sled for my table saw with an angle, and I think it was 8 to 1 or something. And I just ran all that cedar to it.
Yep, I have an 8 to 1
on the chop saw too.
Yeah.
I've never tried it on a chop saw.
No, it's very, it just, you gotta, it's all in the setup.
The only thing I didn't like about the chop saw is that you're trying to hold it back here.
Yes.
Whereas with the table saw with the sled, I just clamped them down and used featherboard to hold them. I just ran them through and take another one and run it through.
Yeah, one thing to remember about any, if you're sawing a scarf, especially if I said cutting on the table saw or cutting it with circular saw, 7 1/4 inch blade is only going to cut 2 inches deep.
Yeah.
Which means that 1/4 inch plywood is as deep as you can go with that circular saw attachment, and cut the entire scarf in one pass.
Could you do a bandsaw on the plank?
You could. I don't
so.
think a bandsaw would cut smooth enough. I mean, in thick lumber, yes. You know, you use thick epoxy and you plane it when you're done. If you wanted to get 2 pieces of plywood, I don't think you could get there. Or anything that, you know, you even, whether it's plywood or whether it's, if you're doing gunnels or something like that, and you know, you frequently can't find a 16-foot board. Like the gunnels on, I don't know whether that's 1 piece or not, but trying to find a piece of wood that long is not easy.
Yeah, I have, my gunnels were 20 foot long, so they have scarves on them. But you see, now being a cheap Scotsman, and I don't know what I was doing when I built my boat. I cut out my planks, I made patterns, and I did all of my scarves by hand, just by eye, using a block plane. And but I probably had. It took me a lot. Didn't take me an hour.
I did bring this.
This is many hours.
Gotten where I was nearly done. It's nearly perfect.
Yeah.
This is my favorite way to clean up that last little bit.
Yeah.
Because you can see, you know, if there's. I had one of these fingers that was good. Yeah. So you can see that this one, I actually cut too deep there and not deep enough there. I can clean that up with this block plane and get pretty good. And you can do that once you've got a flat surface. You can do that pretty well by eye. This is my very favorite 1923 low angle, like 60.5 or whatever it is. And I don't know what's different about it, but it's just way better than any other block plane I've ever used.
My kids bought me one of those lean nose and low angle block planes, and it did, you know, like you said, as long as it was sharp, it did a nice job. And it took me a lot longer than an hour because I had some of my planks are scarfed twice.
Yeah.
You know.
So did you start them as individual planks or entire sheets?
Yeah, no, individual planks.
Okay. Yeah.
So 4 planks on each side, and I don't even want to think about it.
Yeah. So
I keep waiting to go in there and see one of them go doing.